Good day. My name is Marty Teal, and today I'll be talking about sustainable sediment management in reservoirs for you. I'm president of West Consultants in San Diego, California, USA. I'll start off for this talk giving a general overview of some of the challenges that we face, talk about sediment management and how we can accomplish that in reservoirs. Specifically, how can we manage sediment sustainably, which is the main point of this talk. And finally, how does climate change play into that? And then I'll leave you a few key points at the end. So just to start off, for existing reservoirs, which a lot of us are dealing with, we're looking at sediment management more as a way to extend the useful life of the project. However, we have real opportunities when we're planning new reservoirs where we can incorporate the concept of sustainable sediment management all the way through the life cycle, starting with the planning and design. If we start there, we can really accomplish a sustainable project. So to start off, why are we creating a project in the first place? And usually it's to create storage, right? And that's what this is. It's not an ice cube. It's supposed to represent a volume of water. So we have to ask ourselves, why are we creating the storage? How are we planning the project? And how are we going to protect our investment? Usually it's a very large investment to create a dam to make the storage. So how can we make our project sustainable? How can we also design for resilience? That is the ability to bounce back under unforeseen circumstances. So that plays into sediment management. And as generally well known that in many parts of the world, we need carryover storage. That is a sufficient volume of water so that we can ensure the dependable supply during periods of drought. And in some places, which is shown on this graph, this is for the Colorado River in the USA, these droughts can persist over multiple years. We need that carryover storage. And if we want a sustainable project, we have to maintain that storage over time. So here's just a few examples of reservoir sedimentation around the world provided by different people, including a case in India here. But it is a project all over, it is a problem all over the world. And so it's in our common interest to come up with ways to manage sediment sustainably to maintain the life of our projects. And so this is an overview provided by Dr. George Annandale, which is incorporating information about reservoirs in the USA, only since 1900, which are most of the larger dams. And the graph shows that the storage created over time really is pretty much leveled off about 2000. We've had a few new projects, but not much new storage is being created. And so you can see that the curve kind of flattens out after about 2000 or so. But when we incorporate, and that's what that arrow is showing, when we incorporate potential loss of storage due to sedimentation, okay, now we're looking at these other three curves, which range from a small amount of loss to a great amount of loss. And so we could actually be experiencing a decrease in overall storage available within the US. When we look at this on a per capita basis with increasing population, we see that there's a decrease even under existing conditions without considering a loss of storage due to reservoir sedimentation. And when we take into account that loss and we look at on a per capita basis, what has happened if we look back in time and say on a per capita basis, the storage available per person nowadays is about the same as it was in the year 1950. So we are in a bad place. We are losing storage to sedimentation, and it's obviously not sustainable. So when we talk about managing sediment, what we really want to do is we want to minimize the amount of sediment that gets deposited within our reservoirs, which another way of saying that is maximizing the amount of sediment that's either transported through or around the reservoir, because all reservoirs will experience some degree of sedimentation. Offline reservoirs less so than inline reservoirs, but all reservoirs do have some sedimentation. So we'd like to maintain also our distribution of sediment transport. That could be on a seasonal basis. It could also be considering distribution of sediment sizes, which can be important, especially for flora and fauna. The basic strategies to control sedimentation. In the past, typically what was done is someone would estimate the amount of sediment yield per year and say, okay, the life of our project is going to be about 100 years. Let's multiply that, and that's the storage it will create. And there was no thought for what happens afterwards. The sustainable way to look at this, of course, would be to incorporate sediment management, starting with the planning of the project, the conception of the project, the economics of the project, the design of the project, all the way through to operation and maintenance. So more of a project life cycle basis where sediment is considered at every step. So in terms of strategies, there's three broad categories that we can use. One is to reduce production in the watershed upstream. The second would be to route sediment, that is, pass it through or around the reservoir. Or the third would be to remove the sediment. And the third is usually the most difficult and most costly. Here's a few examples. This is from Dr. Sami Kantush and Dr. Sumi in Japan, where if we look at reducing sediment, that would be things like afforestation, restoring ground cover in the watershed upstream of the reservoir. Could be creating check dams to capture sediment before it can make it into the reservoir. If we look at routing sediment, that could be creating diversion weirs and then routing water with sediment into either channels or tunnels around the reservoir. Also, if our reservoir experiences density currents, trying to vent those density currents through the reservoir and passing high concentration sediments downstream would be another option. And then finally, if we have to remove the sediment, we have to excavate. That could be either excavating in the dry or dredging. There's usually some trucking involved, some dewatering involved. We might be able to remove some sediment closer to the dam with low-level gates. But typically, as I mentioned, removal of the sediment after it's already deposited tends to be the most labor-intensive and the most expensive. So looking upstream in the watershed, reducing the amount of sediment coming in. It could be things like plantings, could be protecting stream banks so that they're not eroding and contributing sediment that way. When we look at routing, when we do that, we'd like to preserve the natural sediment transport characteristics, the seasonality, the size classes that we have, the grain sizes. Typically, this happens just upstream at the reservoir or at the upstream end. This can be with or without drawdown. It could be incorporate seasonality. So for example, if you have monsoon season with storms that are creating large concentrations of sediment, if you're able to bypass those or send those large concentrations around your reservoir so they don't deposit. And then the third category, of course, is removal. This could be seasonal or non-seasonal. And as I mentioned, this could be either in the dry or various methods of dredging, either hydraulic dredging, siphon dredging, and so forth. Typically, that has to be passed downstream, and so there is a concern about concentrations in the receiving body, as this can be damaging for wildlife. Here's just an example. This is sediment flushing, a reservoir in Nebraska in the USA, where twice a year they were able to flush sediment out of the pool to restore some storage. So how do you know what measures might work in your reservoir? There's been some investigations done as to which strategies might be more successful, and these will depend on the two ratios. One is the capacity of the reservoir versus the mean annual flood, which is on the x-axis in this plot. And on the y-axis is the capacity of the reservoir versus mean annual sediment load. And depending on those ratios and plotting some projects and measures that have been effective, we can come up with some broad categories to define what type of measures might be more successful depending on where you are in the world and your conditions for those two ratios. I'm going to switch gears for just a minute and talk about sustainable development. There's different ways that people have defined this. I tend to like the Brundtland Commission definition, which says the sustainable development seeks to meet the needs and aspirations of the present without compromising the ability to meet those in the future. That is, it'll guarantee intergenerational equity between one generation and the next. And of course, able to meet that, we need sediment management. Excuse me. So how does this relate to climate change? Well, of course, climate change, we have temperature change, we have meteorologic change and precipitation, especially variability. Our average annual will change, but this also will result in a change of sediment yield. And that sediment yield, if it results in a loss of storage, that in turn results in a loss of reliability and resiliency with our project. Okay, so if we look at plotted this way, climate change will increase the variability, and combined with sedimentation, that will impose a threat to the reliability of the capacity of our project to provide water or space when we need it. So a few key points. Sustainability, if we're going to achieve that, we focus on the life cycle. That is, we incorporate these ideas and concepts of sediment management in every step, from planning and design all the way through operation and maintenance. Okay, if we are able to do that, the sustainable sediment planning and management will provide a resilience to climate change because we'll be able to maintain our storage volume and assure the project benefits. And it will also lead to sustainable development. We'll create that intergenerational equity when we focus on implementing sediment management with the life cycle of the project, and we will ensure the return on our investment. Thank you very much.